Hello everyone, tonight we're talking about the year the sun vanished, and how it wouldn't just ruin your summer plans, it would ruin everything. From plants starving in slow motion, to oceans sealing themselves under a crust of ice, to the sudden realization that half your oxygen comes from microscopic plankton you've never once thanked. This is the kind of darkness that doesn't just turn off the lights, it quietly unravels life itself. If you enjoy sinking into these strange, slightly uncomfortable histories, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find yourself coming back here for more. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm curious to know where this little pocket of light reaches. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe pull a blanket around your shoulders, and let the hum of whatever's near you be your background. We're about to step into a world without a sunrise. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. You're standing in your kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil, when the sun disappears. And I don't mean a bit cloudy disappears, or oh dear, solar eclipse disappears. I mean gone, snuffed out, like the universe just got tired of looking at you and hit the off switch. The funny part is, nothing happens at first, which is confusing, because you've been taught your whole life that no sun equals instant apocalypse. But physics, the smug little show-off, has other plans. For the next 8 minutes and 20 seconds, the light keeps pouring in. The birds are still chirping. The kettle still steams. Your neighbor is still overwatering their plants. This is because the sun, being very far away and very fond of drama, takes a little while to break up with us. Light and gravity travel at the same speed, so you get 8 minutes of blissful ignorance before the bill comes due. If you're unlucky enough to be an amateur astronomer, or just the sort of person who stares at the sky for fun, you might notice it first. The sun's edge won't flicker or fade, it will just vanish. One moment, a blazing disk, the next, nothing, not even a dull red ember. That's when you remember all those diagrams in school about Earth's reliance on solar radiation and think, oh yes, I'm about to freeze to death in the world's longest night. It's also the moment every creature on Earth becomes an unpaid extra in the final act of a very slow horror film. Your pets will look confused, streetlights will stutter to life, planes will start calling air traffic control, asking whether someone forgot to pay the cosmic electricity bill. Somewhere, a politician will go on television and say everything's fine, which, as history shows, is the surest sign that everything's not. What you won't feel yet is the cold. The atmosphere has a sort of thermal inertia, like a stubborn oven that refuses to cool right away. For the next few hours, your city will still feel roughly normal. You might even convince yourself you'll be fine. You won't. The oceans are about to begin a slow-motion collapse into solid ice. Plants are about to suffocate in the dark. And you, who have never gone more than 12 hours without sunlight in your life, are about to meet the sort of cold that politely bypasses your skin and negotiates directly with your bones. But for now, you have those 8 minutes. 8 minutes to look at your phone and wonder why it suddenly feels like a fossil. 8 minutes to remember that you have no emergency food, no backup generator, and no idea what temperature space actually is. 8 minutes to consider that the ancient myths about gods carrying the sun across the sky weren't stupid, because now that the chariot's gone, you'd give anything to see it again. And then, it happens. The light dies. You think you know what darkness is. You've been in basements. You've been in power cuts. You've stumbled to the bathroom at 3 a.m. without turning the light on. But those were friendly darknesses, domestic, manageable, with the promise of a switch somewhere that would make it go away. This one is not friendly. This one has no switch. It falls like a door slamming shut. And you finally understand that light wasn't something you had, it was something the sun loaned you, interest-free every day of your life. Now the loan's been recalled. The sky isn't black the way you've seen in rural camping trips. It's a depthless void, the kind of black that swallows the edges of things so you can't tell where the street ends and the horizon begins. The stars are there, sure, but they're sharp and cold, and they illuminate nothing. They're not candles, they're pinholes in an endless curtain, too far away to help. Within hours, the absence of light starts rearranging your brain. Humans are diurnal, built to wake, eat, and function in the light. The circadian rhythm that's quietly kept you sane since birth is now flailing like a drunk on ice. Your body doesn't know when to sleep, so you start yawning at lunch and staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. Except now, Morning is just a word for still night. Animals notice faster. Birds stop singing because they think it's perpetually bedtime. Cows stand around confused, chewing grass they won't be able to digest much longer because the fields won't regrow. Nocturnal creatures, foxes, owls, raccoons, suddenly find themselves with permanent advantage, like someone left the cheat codes on. Then comes the quiet, the kind of quiet you don't notice until it's there, like an absence that hums. No cars, no distant construction, no rhythmic insect chorus, just the occasional clink of metal cooling in the sudden chill, or the faint rustle of a neighbor moving nervously behind their curtains. It's the same eerie stillness people wrote about after the great volcanic winters to 1816 in New England, when frost coated the fields in June, and 1783 in Iceland, when the air was so thick with Loki's volcanic haze you could barely see the mountains. In those years, the sun was only dimmed, not gone, and still, people starved. You're starting to feel the first bite of cold now, not the sort that makes you shiver and reach for a sweater, but the sort that feels like a hand resting on your chest, reminding you it's going to be here a while. Your phone still works, but every news channel is running the same footage: empty roads, shivering newscasters, scientists trying not to say extinction before they've finished their coffee. You go outside for one last look, because humans are sentimental like that. The air smells sharper, like the first snap of winter, and when you look up, you finally notice what's missing. Not just the sun, but the gradient of color that used to mean day. This is what real night looks like: permanent, unapologetic, and utterly indifferent to whether you survive it. And the cold, patient thing settling into your bones. That's just the opening act. Because now that the light's gone, the world's going to start cooling in earnest, and the real work of freezing you to death begins. You always imagined the end of the world as something noisy: firestorms, earthquakes, maybe some dramatic screaming. Instead, it's this: the slow exhale of the planet as it lets the heat drain away. Without sunlight pouring in, Earth becomes a bad thermos, still warm inside, but bleeding heat from every surface. At first, it's subtle. Degree here, a degree there, as if the weather just got into a sulk. Within 24 hours, the global average drops below freezing. It's not instant frostbite yet, but the chill is no longer something you can shrug off. Your breath fogs indoors. Water in dog bowls gets that delicate skin of ice that used to signal fun winter mornings. Only now it's mid-September, and there's no promise of thaw. Within a week, the oceans start cooling too. This is the part you don't think about. 70% of Earth is water, and it's been acting as a giant heat battery for millions of years. Without sunlight, the surface layers start losing that heat fast. A thin lid of ice forms in sheltered bays first, then spreads, turning harbors into dull mirrors. The deeper layers will take months to freeze, but by then it won't matter. The surface will be locked up, and anything that swims near it will die. You might think the air temperature is the real killer here, but it's the domino effect that's worse. Crops are already in trouble. Even in warm regions, plants are designed for light as much as heat, and photosynthesis is gone the moment the sun blinks out. Greenhouses can keep them going for a bit, but the cost of heating and artificial lighting skyrockets. In historical cold events like the 1816 year without a summer, farmers watched whole fields rot after one night of frost. That was from volcanic dust dimming the sun, not removing it entirely. This is worse. The irony is, humans are pretty good at surviving cold in small doses. Inuit communities, Siberian herders, Andean villagers, they've all adapted to brutal winters for centuries. But those winters came with seasons, with sunlight returning like a promise. This cold doesn't. You can pile on wool, build fires, even dig shelters, but the thermometer just keeps sliding down. In a month, most of the mid-latitudes are sitting at -40 degrees Celsius. In 2 months, you'll be jealous of -40, and it's not just the cold you feel in your fingers and toes. Pipes burst, power lines sag and snap under ice, and diesel fuel gels in tanks. Cities start smelling like camping trips gone wrong. Wood smoke, propane, and the faint tank of panic. Emergency shelters overflow. In the darker corners of the news, they stop reporting the temperature altogether because people don't want to know. Somewhere in all this, your own body starts running the numbers. It learns the hard way that hypothermia doesn't need dramatic exposure, just a slow, steady loss of heat. Shivering stops being useful after a while. Fingers stop obeying. You keep telling yourself that spring will come. But spring is a word invented by people who lived on a planet with a sun, and as the cold settles in, you realize the first frost was just the polite warning. The real killer is already on the move, not just through your garden or your town, but through the roots of every living thing you've ever relied on for food. You don't notice it right away, because plants are polite. They die quietly. No screaming, no dramatic falling over. Just a slow fade, like someone dialing down the color in the world. At first, the leaves go limp, then they curl. Then they turn the sort of gray-green that tells you they've given up trying. It's not the cold that kills them first, it's the dark. Photosynthesis isn't optional. It's not some bonus feature plants use when they're feeling productive. It's the entire point of their existence. No light means no photosynthesis. No photosynthesis means no glucose. And no glucose means the plant is starving, even if the soil around it is packed with nutrients. Think of it as trying to eat without a mouth. The machinery is there, but there's no way to power it. The knock-on effect is instant and merciless. Grass stops growing. Trees stop making sugars to feed their roots. Algae in the oceans, the microscopic base of the marine food web, just quit. You probably didn't care about plankton before. You do now, because they produce half the oxygen you breathe and feed everything from krill to whales. Without them, the oceans start to go silent. In your own kitchen, the crisis looks smaller, almost manageable. You can eat stored food for a while, but every bite is now part of a finite countdown. Rice, beans, flour, they're all products of harvests that will never come again. Even if you grow vegetables indoors under artificial light, the cost of generating that light without the sun makes each tomato taste like gold bullion. Historically, even mild sunlight shortages caused chaos. In 1816, with the year without a summer dimming skies across the northern hemisphere, grain prices in Europe tripled. That was with the sun still technically present. Remove it entirely, and it's not a market fluctuation. It's the start of mass famine. Livestock don't fare much better. Cows can't graze on frozen, light-starved fields. Chickens stop laying when their biological clocks can't find day or night. You can feed them from stockpiles for a while, but remember, those stockpiles were built in a world where crops grew back. Now, every bale of hay or sack of feed is just one more tick on a doomsday clock. It's also around now that you start seeing something strange in your own body. Fatigue, headaches, that low mood you thought was just from the cold. It's the absence of light doing its work on you, too. Without daylight, your body stops making vitamin D, your circadian rhythm crumbles, and your brain chemistry starts whispering that maybe getting out of bed isn't worth it. In 1816, records show people growing listless, irritable, even desperate, under weeks of dim skies. And again, that was with the sun only muted. This isn't a harvest failure you can fix next season. This is the extinction of agriculture as a concept, and it's not a future problem. It's already happening, silently, invisibly, in the chloroplasts of every plant you've ever depended on. Which is fine, you might think, if you've got enough canned food. But what happens when the thing you thought would run out first isn't the food, but the air? Fields don't look ruined at first. They just look still, like they're waiting for something that's never coming. The soil is hardening, the stalks are brittle, and the last green you see is fading into the same dull palette as the sky. Farmers stop talking about next season because the word season doesn't mean anything anymore. Historically, even a minor shift in sunlight has been enough to starve millions. In 1816, after Mount Tambora filled the atmosphere with volcanic ash, Europe saw frosts in July and August. Oats failed in Ireland, wheat prices soared in France, and New England had snow in June. That was just from a thin filter over the sun. Now the filter is absolute. Grain silos become fortresses. Food shipments move under guard, because desperation strips people of politeness long before it strips them of life. Cities that once relied on daily deliveries to fill supermarket shelves watch those shelves turn into long metal echoes. In the countryside, livestock are slaughtered early because there's no feed to get them through the winter, and this winter has no end. Meat floods the market for a week or two, then vanishes. In poor regions, famine is immediate. In wealthy ones, it's slower but just as inevitable. Governments talk about rationing, but rationing implies there's a new supply coming. There isn't. What you have is all you'll ever have. Every meal is now a subtraction. The human body can survive weeks without food, but whole societies can't. by the second or third month, famine, riots break out, echoes of the bread uprisings in Paris before the revolution, or the food marches in Russia during 1917. Hunger has a way of rewriting politics overnight. The tragedy is how predictable it all is. Agriculture is the one invention that allowed billions to exist at all. Without sunlight, the system collapses to something older, meaner, and much smaller. Hunting and foraging won't save you. Wild animals are starving too, and the edible plants have already died. Fishing, possible. For a while, if you can break through the ice and the fish haven't already eaten each other. And all of it is happening fast. In volcanic winters, it took months for the worst crop failures to ripple through the food supply. Without the sun, the ripple is more like a cliff edge. One moment you have bread. The next, you're pulling apart the last loaf and wondering if it's better to eat it all at once or hide it from your neighbors. Yet this isn't even the whole story of collapse. Hunger is only half of it. The other half is in the oceans, where a far older and far more fragile chain of life is already breaking. History has already staged rehearsals for this sort of catastrophe, though those versions were just grim previews. The most famous is 1816, the so-called year without a summer, when Mount Tambora spat so much ash into the atmosphere that sunlight dimmed across the globe. Crops failed from China to the United States. Europe's wheat prices doubled. Ireland lost its potato harvest, and in Switzerland, starving farmers ate their own seed grain. That was with the sun still in place, only wearing a dusty veil. The effects didn't need years to unfold. Within weeks of Tambora's eruption, frost bit into New England fields in June, ice-covered lakes in Pennsylvania in July. In France, vineyards rotted on the vine. Even livestock keeled over, either from hunger or from eating moldy feed that would have been left untouched in better times. And this is important. Temperatures then dropped by less than a single degree on average. Less than a degree, and people were already writing about it, as if the sky itself had declared war. Go back further, and the stories get harsher. In 1600, Huayna Putina erupted in Peru. Russia spent the next 3 years in famine. A third of its population starved. The Loki eruption in Iceland, 1783, coated Europe in a sulphurous haze, so thick that crops withered in their fields. In Iceland itself, nearly 80% of sheep and half the human population died, all from a partial dimming of the sun. These events matter because they show what happens when the planet's thermostat is nudged ever so slightly toward cold. Remove the sun entirely, and that nudge becomes a violent shove. There's no bad harvest year followed by a recovery. There's no recovery at all. You can't wait out the weather when the weather has been permanently cancelled. Volcanic winters also gave us a preview of the social fallout. Grain riots in England, mass migration from Europe to America. In France, lingering hunger after Tambora's year helped set the stage for political unrest. People don't politely wait their turn in a breadline when their children are skeletal. They loot, they burn, they topple governments. And that was in a world where the famine would eventually end. The eerie thing about looking back at these disasters is how modern they feel. You can read a diary entry from a Bavarian farmer in 1816 describing frost killing his rye in July and realize he'd recognize exactly what's happening to your garden right now. He'd just be shocked at how much faster it's happening. But famine and frost are still just the surface symptoms. In the oceans, which fed countless coastal communities, even in volcanic winters, the darkness is starting to do something irreversible. The smallest things are dying first, and they take everything else with them when they go. Scientists have been simulating this nightmare for decades, though they usually imagine it with mushroom clouds instead of a missing sun. The nuclear winter models were meant to answer a grim question. If enough cities burned at once, would the soot and ash climb high enough into the atmosphere to block sunlight worldwide? The answer, calculated in the 1980s and refined ever since, was yes, and the results look disturbingly like what's happening to you now. In those scenarios, firestorms send black carbon into the stratosphere, where it lingers for months or years. Temperatures drop by double digits within weeks. Photosynthesis grinds to a halt. Crops fail. Fisheries collapse. Billions, not millions, of people starve. And remember, those projections assumed the sun was still technically there, just hidden behind a global curtain of smoke. You're living in the curtain without the light behind it. Modern supercomputer runs have only made the picture bleaker. In 2022, a study on a full-scale nuclear exchange showed global calorie production falling by up to 90% within a year. Even nations far from the war zone, places with no direct damage, would see famine deaths in the tens or hundreds of millions. And that's without counting the chaos, disease, and violence that ride in on the back of hunger. What these models underline is how tightly human survival is leashed to sunlight. No amount of stored grain or clever greenhouse tech can keep up once the planet's energy budget collapses. Even if you could light and heat vast farms artificially, the fuel and infrastructure demands would be astronomical. In a nuclear winter, the hope is that sunlight eventually filters back. In this case, there's nothing to filter back. There's another detail in those simulations worth noticing. The oceans suffer just as much as the land. Soot blocks sunlight from penetrating the upper layers, killing plankton, the same tiny photosynthesizers now dying en masse in your sunless seas. In nuclear winter, marine ecosystems might limp along until the sky clears. Here, they won't limp at all. They'll just stop. And when the plankton go, so does everything above them. Krill, fish, squid, whales, all gone. The fishing boats that used to bring protein to coastal markets become useless, trapped in ice and chasing empty nets. In past volcanic winters, desperate coastal communities at least had the ocean as a fallback. Now, the ocean is closing its doors too. So the great academic horror story, the one meant to scare nations into avoiding mutual destruction, turns out to be your lived reality. Only worse. No war, no bombs, just the same darkness and the same cold, stretched out without an end date. It's here that the world begins to divide into two kinds of places, the ones that can hang on a little longer, and the ones that can't, and the difference between them has less to do with wealth than with geography. The seas always seemed eternal to you, restless, deep, and indifferent to human timelines. But it turns out even they had a secret dependency: sunlight. Without it, the ocean begins to change in ways that make your frozen garden look like a minor inconvenience. Surface waters cool first. The wind whips away what little heat remains, and the top layer begins to congeal into a lid of ice. In sheltered bays and harbors, this happens within weeks. In open water, it takes a little longer, but longer here still means months, not years. Once that ice lid is in place, the ocean underneath starts to suffocate. Normally, sunlight penetrates the top 100 meters or so, feeding phytoplankton, microscopic plants that are, inconveniently, the foundation of the entire marine food chain. Now they're gone. It's not just that whales and sardines and tuna lose their food supply. It's that the oxygen production of the entire planet takes a hit. Half of the air you breathe is made by these tiny, floating photosynthesizers. Without them, oxygen levels in the atmosphere begin to drift downward. Not enough to choke you immediately, but enough that, given time, climbing a flight of stairs could feel like scaling Everest. And here's the really cruel part. Cold water holds more dissolved carbon dioxide. As the seas chill, they start sucking down the CO in the atmosphere like an enormous, slow-moving lung. The chemistry shifts. Acidity rises. Even if some stubborn, non-photosynthetic life forms hang on, their shells and skeletons begin to dissolve in the new corrosive soup. Historically, even small temperature drops have caused marine chaos. During the Little Ice Age, fishing grounds shifted or collapsed entirely, pushing coastal communities into famine. After the Loki eruption in 1783, Iceland's waters cooled enough to decimate fish stocks, forcing people inland to fight over dwindling grazing land. That was from a single volcanic event. Now you've cut off the sun indefinitely, and the fish aren't migrating, they're dying where they float. Within a year, sea ice is expanding far beyond the poles. The North Atlantic looks like one continuous frozen plain, and the Southern Ocean becomes an unbroken collar of white. Shipping lanes close. Coastal cities that once relied on temperate harbors are iced in like Siberian river ports. The ocean, which once moderated Earth's climate, now reflects heat away into space, locking in the cold even further. If you thought the collapse of agriculture was bad, this is worse in one quiet way. You can see dead fields, but you can't see the collapse of an entire food web happening hundreds of meters below the surface. By the time you notice no fish in the markets, no gulls circling the shore, no fishing boats leaving port, it's already over. And once the oceans freeze over, the planet stops being a place with seasons and becomes a deep freeze with some decorative mountains. The problem is, the ice doesn't just stay politely at the shore. It begins to creep inland, changing the land into something unrecognizable. It starts at the edges, a skim of white over puddles, a brittle crust in the soil. Harmless, you tell yourself, temporary. But frost is patient, and this frost has no reason to leave. Each night it digs a little deeper, turning topsoil into permafrost, freezing the groundwater solid, and splitting roads and foundations with the slow, smug strength of ice. Within a few months, the frost line has moved so far down that the concept of thaw no longer applies. This is no longer the seasonal freeze that farmers and gardeners plan for. It's a geological shift. Ice sheets begin their slow march out of the polar regions, like old predators reclaiming territory they once ruled. Greenland, Antarctica, those are just the capitals. The provinces are everywhere now. In previous cold snaps, like the peak of the Little Ice Age, glaciers in the Alps advanced far enough to bury entire villages. In the sunless world, that process is sped up and spread out. Valleys fill with moving ice. Rivers vanish beneath solid lids that never crack. Snow falls, but the real killer is the ice beneath it, dense, immovable, reshaping the land like an architect with a grudge. Human infrastructure is no match. Roads buckle and disappear. Power lines snap under the weight of rime. Airports become useless runways of frozen grit. Even nuclear plants, those supposed lifelines of heat and light, struggle when intake pipes freeze and ice pressure warps concrete. The handful of greenhouses still running now burn precious fuel just to keep the frost from crawling in under the doors. Historically, frost has been one of the fastest killers of civilizations. Archaeologists have traced abandoned Norse farms in Greenland back to the encroachment of permafrost, which choked off grazing and destroyed soil structure. Here, the scale is global, and there is no Greenland to escape to. What's unsettling is how quiet the takeover is. No roaring flood, no earthquake, just the slow suffocation of landscapes under layers of frozen permanence. Forests lose their grip on the ground as roots meet ice instead of soil. Trees topple in silence. Lakes expand upwards instead of outwards, lifting frozen fish toward a lightless surface they'll never break through. People start adapting in strange, desperate ways. Towns huddle around geothermal vents, drilling through the ice to find the last running water. Others burrow down, trying to use the Earth's own residual heat as a shield. But the frost always presses in, and it never retreats. By the time you realize this is permanent, that next spring is a fairy tale. The ice has already set the stage for its next act, turning the cold from a hardship into a total collapse of the systems that kept you alive. And the first of those systems to fail will be the ones you thought were untouchable, the things you assumed could keep running no matter what. The belief that technology will save you is stubborn. People cling to it the way they used to cling to spring forecasts and long-range weather reports. We have electricity, they say. We have fuel. But technology has always been a partnership with the environment, and the environment has just stopped returning calls. First to go is transport. Diesel fuel thickens in the cold, turning trucks into frozen statues in parking lots. Roads disappear under meters of snow and ice. So even if the engines worked, there's nowhere to drive. Shipping lanes are sealed shut by sea ice, stranding cargo in ports that no longer function. Air travel collapses when dicing fluid freezes on the tarmac before it even hits the planes. Next comes the power grid. Lines snap under the weight of ice, or simply stop delivering electricity when the generating stations fail. Coal plants can't get shipments. Gas pipelines freeze. Nuclear plants limp along for a while, but cooling systems need flowing water, and the rivers are now locked in ice from bank to bank. Solar farms are just black panels under white drifts, as useful as picnic tables in a blizzard. Water infrastructure was never built for this. Pipes burst, pumps seize up, and treatment plants shut down when staff can't reach them. In some places, the only available water is melted ice, which is as time-consuming to gather as it is to heat. Fuel for melting becomes a currency, as valuable as food, sometimes more. In historical cold disasters, like the Siberian freezes of the 20th century, the state could at least bring in supplies by train or truck. Now, no route is open, no convoy possible. The cold doesn't just slow down repairs, it makes repairs irrelevant. You can fix a pipeline, but you can't unfreeze a continent. Hospitals hang on longest in cities that still have some fuel reserves, but even they start cutting off sections of the building to save heat. Equipment designed for room temperature begins to fail. Batteries drain faster. Medication freezes solid in storage. In rural areas, clinics simply close and leave people to improvise their own care, or not at all. The breakdown isn't dramatic. It's not a movie explosion or a sudden blackout. It's a series of absences that pile up. The lights are on in fewer houses each night. The hum of machinery fades from the background. Radios stop broadcasting. What remains is the low hiss of wind and the crack of ice shifting, the soundtrack of a world where industry has gone silent. For those still clinging on, the failure of infrastructure is more than an inconvenience. It's the loss of the invisible skeleton that held society upright. Without it, the systems that distribute food, medicine, heat, and water collapse in unison. And when those systems collapse, something else rushes in to take their place. Not organized, not planned, but inevitable. That something is the scramble for survival. And it's about to strip away whatever manners the cold hadn't already frozen out of you. It's not a wave. Waves crash and then recede. This is a tide that only moves in one direction. People start dying in small numbers at first. An elderly neighbor, a child with asthma, someone who ran out of heart medication when the pharmacy closed. It's quiet, almost unremarkable, until you notice that the street hasn't had fresh footprints in days. Cold kills differently than hunger, but the two work well together. Hypothermia isn't the dramatic frostbite of adventure movies. It's a slow surrender. Your body shunts blood away from your skin to keep the core warm, which makes your fingers clumsy. You're thinking slower. You stop feeling the cold after a while, which is your brain's way of lying to you right before the end. Starvation works in the same deceitful way. Fatigue that feels like laziness. Dizziness that feels like you just stood up too fast. And then one day your body decides to stop burning the last of its reserves. Historical records are brutal on this point. In the Russian famine of 1601 to 1603, triggered by volcanic winter, mortality estimates reach into the millions. A third of the population gone in less than 3 years. That was with some sunlight, some seasons, some harvests, and it still hollowed out entire regions. Now, there's no seasonality to wait for, no break in the cold. Mass graves appear because the ground is too frozen for individual burials. In smaller settlements, the dead are left in outbuildings, stacked in frozen neatness until someone can decide what to do with them. In cities, authorities try to manage collection, but manpower collapses with the same speed as everything else. The frost preserves bodies almost perfectly, which is not the comfort it sounds like. In past famines, the social fabric shredded fast. Neighbors stopped sharing, villages closed themselves off, and travelers were turned away with force. Here, the shredding is instant. Food theft becomes as routine as weather complaints used to be. Violence isn't planned, it's opportunistic. A loaf of bread here, a pot of fuel there. Nobody wants to be a criminal. The cold just makes morality feel like an optional luxury. For those still clinging to life, the mental toll starts to match the physical one. Cold is exhausting. Hunger is exhausting. But watching the people around you vanish, first from the streets, then from memory, is worse. The population curve drops, not like a line, but like a cliff face. And yet, in this thinning human landscape, there are pockets that seem to hold out longer. Places where the cold doesn't cut as deep, or the food lasts a little longer, or the geography itself offers a strange sort of protection. They're not paradises, nothing is, but compared to the rest of the world, there's something dangerously close to hope. Every extinction story has its holdouts. In the sunless earth, they're not who you expect. It's not the megacities with glittering infrastructure or the nations with the largest militaries. It's small, odd corners of the map, places that were already living with one foot in scarcity before the sun left, and so had the muscle memory for it. Some volcanic winter records hint at this. After Tambra's eruption in 1815, while Europe and North America were spiraling into famine, certain island communities fared better. They weren't rich, but they were used to storing food for lean months, fishing in poor conditions, and rationing without an army to enforce it. Even parts of Iceland, devastated by the Loki eruption a generation earlier, managed to cling to survival, thanks to preserved fish, fermented dairy, and a cultural stubbornness that treated hardship like an annual guest. In the sunless year, survival is about insulation from chaos as much as insulation from the cold. Isolated fishing villages last a little longer, not because the fish are thriving, they're not, but because the people have smokehouses, drying racks, and barrels of salted protein that can stretch for months. Remote settlements near geothermal heat sources, Iceland again, Parts of the Aleutians, the Kamchatka Peninsula, can at least keep buildings above freezing without burning through every scrap of fuel. High-altitude Andean towns, perversely, have a small advantage at first. They've always dealt with thin air, cold nights, and short growing seasons, so their crops and livestock are already adapted to harsher margins. But even they can't grow without light. The darkness just slows their fall. For the rest of the world, these pockets are almost mythical. Word travels. Someone's cousin heard that an island in the North Atlantic still has bread, that a fishing hamlet in Alaska hasn't lost power. Desperation makes people believe in sanctuaries, and belief makes them move. In past famines, migration was dangerous but possible. Now, with frozen oceans and grounded plains, reaching these places is like trying to walk to the moon. What's most striking is how these resilient spots don't think of themselves as safe. Their survival is temporary. Every meal one step closer to the last. They hoard what they can, lock away their preserves, and eye newcomers with the same suspicion you'd give a stranger standing too close to your last candle. Isolation protects them from the collapse outside, but it also isolates them from help when the collapse finally arrives at their door. And inevitably, it does. The cold doesn't care about geography. It just moves at different speeds. The only real question is, what fails first? The food, the heat, or the will to keep going? In the places where isolation isn't an option, the collapse takes a different form. Not slower, not kinder, just louder. It's the social order itself that shatters next. Order doesn't vanish all at once. It frays, rules become suggestions, laws become polite requests, and the idea of public good starts to feel like a bad joke from a warmer time. At first, the old systems still pretend to function. Mayors give speeches. Police patrols show up on schedule. Courts hear cases, but everyone involved knows the machinery is running on fumes. History offers a depressing preview. In 1816, during the year without a summer, food riots swept Europe. In Britain, grain convoys were attacked on the road. In Switzerland, starving farmers smashed bakery windows and stole whatever loaves they could find. And that was during a temporary dimming, not permanent night. In volcanic famines, riots were often contained because people still believed the hardship would end. Remove that hope, and restraint goes with it. In the sunless cold, governments try rationing. But rationing assumes two lies: that the distribution is fair, and that there will be more to distribute. Both collapse quickly. Warehouses are raided from the inside. Relief shipments disappear before they leave the port. Neighbors start locking doors in daylight, not for burglars, but for hungry acquaintances who can no longer be trusted. Armed groups form, sometimes calling themselves militias, sometimes protection committees, though what they're protecting is mostly themselves. In cities, abandoned office towers become fortresses. In rural areas, fortified farmsteads reappear, complete with guards who remember the owner's face but not their old friendships. The cold adds a strange etiquette to the chaos. Fights end quickly because nobody wants to spend too long outside. Looters move in fast, grab fuel or food, and vanish before frostbite claims their fingers. Violence becomes targeted: a warehouse, a greenhouse, a fuel depot, rather than random street mayhem. Not because people are kind, but because they're practical. Refugee flows become impossible to manage. In volcanic winters, people could move toward less affected regions, even across continents. Now, ice blocks the sea routes, fuel shortages kill the roads, and the journey is often deadlier than staying put. The only real migrations are on foot, and those end in drifts of snow and silence. Even the language shifts. Words like community and neighborhood are replaced by territory and claim. The few functioning radios broadcast not news, but instructions: which streets are safe, which buildings are off limits, where to leave the dead. What disappears fastest isn't just food or heat, it's trust. You stop believing anyone outside your own group will act in your interest, and they stop believing it about you. That vacuum doesn't stay empty for long. Into it steps the only power structure still fully functional in the dark, the one that already knew how to run things when people were desperate. Once the first frantic months pass, there's a shift, not toward improvement, but toward permanence. The cold stops feeling like bad weather and starts feeling like the planet's new skin. Every surface is locked in white or gray, every horizon frozen flat, and every calendar irrelevant. In past ice ages, glaciers took millennia to advance. Without the sun, They don't just advance, they sprint. The climate becomes static in the worst way. There are no warm seasons, no cycles to plan around. The air hovers at lethal cold year-round, and the oceans, now capped with ice, reflect even more heat away into space. In climate science, it's called positive feedback, the kind of positivity nobody asked for. The human mind tries to adapt, but adaptation here means lowering expectations to the ground. In volcanic winters, farmers used to watch the skies for signs of change, a clearer sun, a shift in the wind, and hold on to the hope of the next planting season. Now, there's no such thing as next planting season. The soil beneath the ice is dead, its microbes frozen, its structure shattered by frost. Even if the sun came back tomorrow, you'd need years of thaw before you could coax anything out of it. The few remaining pockets of habitation become more like bunkers than communities. Geothermal zones, underground complexes, and the rare nuclear-powered outpost form the last dots of human heat. Life there is less about living and more about maintenance, keeping the generators running, the air breathable, the walls intact. Every breakdown is an existential crisis, and yet, the stability of the deep freeze brings its own dangers. In the chaos of the collapse, people moved, scavenged, fought. Now, with everything locked down, the danger shifts to stagnation. Supplies dwindle slowly but steadily, skills fade, and the population ages in place. A child born in this world won't remember rain, wind in the grass, or the smell of wet soil. Only the filtered air of the shelter and the endless creak of the ice above. Earth's climate system has always had buffers. The ocean currents, the carbon cycle, the tilt of its axis, but they all relied on the sun's constant input. Remove that input, and you don't just change the weather. You erase the concept of weather entirely. What's left is a single, unbroken season of cold, enforced by a planet-sized mirror of ice. This is the point where survival is no longer about outlasting the crisis. It's about accepting that the crisis is the environment now. And in an environment like that, even the most secure pockets of humanity start to face the question that's been waiting since the first day. The light died. How long can you keep the machinery of life running when there's nothing left to fuel it? There's no last dramatic collapse, no sudden bang to mark the end. The final stage of a sunless Earth is a kind of slow erasure, the kind you don't notice day by day until you try to recall the world as it was and find the details slipping away. The forests, the rain, the sound of birds, they become like half-remembered dreams. So distant they feel borrowed from someone else's life. The ice no longer grows in leaps. It simply is, settled into every contour of the land, a permanent casing over a planet that once breathed. Glaciers now cover former deserts, mountain passes are buried under kilometers of packed snow, and the seas where they can still be called seas are silent plains of ancient ice. Whatever lies beneath is sealed away for good. The last human pockets are scattered and small, clinging to warmth from geothermal vents, nuclear plants that haven't yet failed, or whatever artificial heat systems can be patched together from dwindling spare parts. They are not communities in the old sense, more like maintenance crews keeping the life support on for one more month, then one more after that. Oxygen levels slowly thin, not enough to suffocate outright, but enough to keep everyone tired, their chests heavy, their thoughts fogged. Food is rationed to the point where full becomes a memory, and fresh anything is a myth. In some enclaves, survival has become a numbers game, not in years, but in calories, liters, and degrees above freezing. From orbit, if anyone was still there to see, the planet would look beautiful in its own way. A perfect white sphere, marbled with shadow where the ice forms ridges and cliffs, gleaming in starlight like a frozen jewel. It would be easy to mistake it for a thriving world, if you didn't know the stillness was total. And yet, life has a habit of persisting in ways that don't make sense. Somewhere under the ice, extremophiles cling to geothermal seeps, microbes drift in brine pockets, insects lie dormant, and in the deepest caves, there may still be warmth enough for something with a pulse. These are not lifelines for you, not really, more like the faint signatures of a planet refusing to be entirely dead. But for humans, the story narrows. Without a sun, every resource is a countdown. Every shelter is a battery running out, and the moment the last heat source fails in the last habitable pocket, the Earth will be uniform again, a single unbroken monument to the cold. That's the real ending. Not fire, not chaos, but an immaculate stillness. A world so quiet, you could imagine it was always this way. When the fields failed, the first place people turned wasn't the forest or the river, it was the dark, dry spaces they'd been filling for months, sometimes years, with the quiet intention of not dying. Granaries, root cellars, jars sealed in wax, barrels of pickled fish. These were the lifeboats of a sinking season. The Egyptians, watching the Nile's floods turn fickle, piled grain into state warehouses so enormous they might as well have been temples to wheat. In the Andes, the Inca perfected colcas, storehouses built high in the mountains, where cold, dry air could keep maize edible for years. In medieval Europe, entire communities relied on the low, stone-walled chambers beneath their homes, where cabbages, carrots, and turnips slumbered in the dark under mounds of straw. The system worked as long as the disaster was short. A bad harvest year could be softened by the previous year's plenty. A few months of frost could be outlasted with sacks of dried beans and barrels of salted pork. But when nothing grew for more than a season, the mathematics of hunger caught up. Each visit to the storehouse was subtraction, and subtraction has a way of emptying itself faster than anyone plans. Stored grain had its own enemies, not just mouths, but claws and mandibles. Rats and mice could strip a year's supply to crumbs in a week, and in many famines, entire villages fought wars of attrition against their own rodent populations. In tropical stores, weevils hollowed out rice kernels until the sacks looked full but collapsed into dust at the first touch. Preservation was a race against not only time, but every other creature that wanted to eat what humans were saving. There was also the politics of storage. In Egypt's famine years, grain rations were carefully measured, but the priests and nobles measured more generously for themselves. In medieval towns, cellars could be sealed and guarded, not just from thieves but from neighbors who began to treat friendship as a form of food entitlement. In the Inca Empire, the colcas were state-patrolled. Access wasn't about proximity but loyalty. In every system, storage wasn't just about survival, it was about who got to survive. When the doors of the granaries finally stood open on nothing but dust and husks, the next step was obvious, if less certain: finding something edible outside the boundaries of cultivation. The countryside would have to be combed, not for abundance, but for whatever was still stubborn enough to grow without permission. The art of keeping food edible long after it should have rotted is as old as hunger itself. When nothing grew, the difference between the living and the soon-to-be remembered often came down to how well a community had mastered the tricks of salt, smoke, air, and time. Preservation was not a side hobby for the cautious. It was an insurance policy written in brine and ash. In coastal settlements, fish hung in long rows above slow, smoky fires, their skins turning to brittle parchment, their flesh hardened into something that could survive months of damp storage. Inland, meat was packed into barrels with layers of salt so thick it resembled geological strata. Every slice taken months later had to be soaked and boiled to strip away the mineral bite, unless one was desperate enough to eat it as it was, which many were. Fermentation was the more alchemical method, and in lean times it took on the glow of sorcery. Cabbages became sharp, sour knots of sauerkraut. Milk, instead of spoiling, thickened into yogurt, or hardened into cheeses that could wait in cellars for the right moment. These foods didn't just last, they transformed, their new flavors becoming associated with survival itself. Entire cuisines, in fact, were built on the taste of not starving. Drying required patience and sun, or, in its absence, fire and a constant watch against mold. Grains could be spread thin over mats near hearths, roots sliced and laid on racks above embers, fruit shrunk into leathery discs that could be softened again in stews when nothing fresh remained. In the Andes, potatoes were frozen overnight and sun-dried into chuno, a food that could last for years in sacks if kept dry, sustaining villages through the years when frost killed entire harvests. Of course, preservation was never a guarantee. Smokehouses burned down, salt ran out, mold crept in when someone forgot to turn the racks, and always there was the temptation to eat the preserved food too soon, to taste security before it had done its real work. In siege accounts from medieval Europe, commanders complained of their own garrisons devouring the winter stores in autumn feasts, the celebration of which faded quickly when snow fell on empty lots. When the last barrel was scraped and the last jar emptied, the skill of preservation no longer mattered. The problem shifted from making food last to finding any food at all. and that meant leaving the built world behind to search for what the wild still offered. When the fields stopped producing, the boundaries between cultivated land and wilderness dissolved. People who'd spent their whole lives coaxing food from ordered rows of grain now stepped into the woods and marshes with the eyes of beginners, searching for anything green that wouldn't kill them. For some, this was a return to skills their grandparents still remembered. For others, it was a dangerous experiment in trial and error, where the margin for a wrong guess could be as short as a single meal. Famine foraging followed a predictable pattern. At first, the most obvious and safest wild foods vanished. Hazelnuts, acorns, chestnuts, berries. Streamsides were stripped of watercress, meadows plundered for dandelion greens and wild sorrel. Where mushrooms grew, people combed the forest floor with baskets and cautious fingers, relying on folk knowledge to avoid the ones that would turn a meal into a funeral. In Europe's great famines, edible fungi like chanterelles and porcini became staples for the desperate. Their usual role as peasant food suddenly elevated to essential survival. Inevitably, the search pushed into the realm of famine foods, the plants normally avoided for being bitter, fibrous, or mildly toxic. Acorns could be leached of tannins with repeated boilings. Wild tubers, sharp and astringent, could be roasted into something just shy of palatable. In the Pacific Islands, cycads deadly when raw were soaked, pounded, and washed again and again until the toxins bled away, leaving a gritty flour. In every region, these foods carried the taste of labor as much as of hunger. The archaeological record speaks to how common this fallback was. Ancient grinding stones bear residues of seeds too small or hard to bother with in good years, proof that people once knelt for hours to crush handfuls of bitter grain into coarse meal. In more recent history, Irish coastal communities turned to foraging seaweed during the potato blight, drying and grinding it into bread, while inland families scoured hedgerows for nettles and dock leaves to boil into thin green soups. The danger wasn't only in poisoning. The more desperate the search, the deeper people pushed into the territory of other hungry creatures. Wild boar rooting for the same bulbs, bears stripping berry canes, deer grazing on tender shoots. Foragers had to weigh the risk of going farther afield against the certainty of coming home with nothing. Even when the harvest was good, wild foods rarely fed entire communities. They supplemented, added variety, or bridged the gap between harvests. In a famine, they became the centerpiece of the meal, but never enough to replace agriculture. Eventually, even the forest and shoreline were emptied. Barren hedges, stripped trees, and silent groves told the same story. The land had been asked for more than it could give. Once the plants were gone, attention turned to what moved through the landscape. Instead, creatures that could walk, swim, or fly, and whose meat might buy a few more days before the hunger returned. When the green world failed, the moving world became the next target. Hunting and fishing, which in good years might have been seasonal supplements or special feasts, suddenly carried the full weight of survival. Rivers, lakes, forests, and coasts became contested zones, where people were not just gathering food, but stripping an ecosystem bare in real time. At first, there was plenty, or at least, the appearance of it. Game animals had been feeding all season, and rivers still carried their usual runs of fish. In many places, fishing intensified overnight. Nets, hooks, and traps were set in greater numbers, and methods once considered too destructive for normal use, damming streams, draining ponds, became standard. Coastal communities worked themselves to exhaustion, hauling in whatever could be pulled from the sea, from prized species down to the smallest, bony fish that would normally have been thrown back. In the Arctic and subarctic, seal hunts expanded far beyond sustainable levels, as communities doubled or tripled their take to offset collapsing food imports. Hunting followed the same pattern. First deer, boar, and larger mammals. Then smaller game like hares, squirrels, and birds. Finally, anything that could be caught and eaten: dogs, cats, even the pests that had been raiding the granaries. Written accounts from medieval European famines are matter-of-fact about this progression, describing how noble hunting forests, once carefully managed for sport, were emptied within months. In early modern Japan, records note that villagers in bad years trapped every bird they could find, even species that were normally left alone because they tasted foul. The pressure on wildlife was immediate and visible. Game became skittish and scarce within weeks. Fish runs shrank year to year, until nets came up empty more often than not. In some island communities, shellfish beds were stripped bare, and the reefs themselves damaged by the frantic digging. The problem was simple. In agricultural societies, hunting and fishing were never meant to carry the entire caloric load of the population. When they had to, the numbers simply didn't add up. There were also social tensions. Fishing rights that had once been guarded by custom, who could cast nets where, who had access to which spawning grounds, were ignored under the pressure of hunger. Fights broke out over river bends and harbor entrances. Poaching in noble forests became so common during European famines that the penalties, normally severe, were sometimes quietly ignored. Punishing the starving served no one. Still, these methods, like the granaries and the wild plants, had limits. The waters emptied. The forests fell silent. When no hoofprints marked the snow and no fish stirred the nets, the choice narrowed to something more desperate: slaughtering the animals that had been companions and workmates. The ones people normally fed, sheltered, and named. When the traps were empty and the forests quiet, eyes turned inward, toward the barn, the stable, the byre. Domesticated animals had always been a kind of living savings account, a way to store food in muscle and bone until it was needed. In good years, that need meant celebrations, weddings, midwinter feasts. In famine years, it meant survival at the expense of the future. The first to go were usually the animals kept for meat anyway: pigs, goats, sheep. But the slaughter quickly moved beyond that into what, in normal times, would have been unthinkable: oxen that pulled plows, horses that hauled carts, dairy cows in mid. The killing of working animals was more than a loss of calories and waiting. It was the dismantling of the machinery of agriculture itself. When the famine ended, if it ended, there would be fewer beasts to plow, fewer to breed, and no easy way to replace them. Historical records are blunt about the speed of this unraveling. In the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, chroniclers noted the disappearance of draft animals from entire regions of Europe. In Russia's time of troubles, famine 1601-1603, herds were so diminished that it took decades to rebuild them. The economic impact lingered long after the hunger had passed, with smaller harvests following in the wake of smaller herds. Sometimes the slaughter cut even deeper into cultural taboos. Sacred cattle were killed during severe African droughts. In parts of South Asia, famine loosened the religious prohibitions around eating beef. Dogs and cats, normally companions or guardians, became part of the famine diet, often in secrecy. Their absence explained away to children as runaways. Even poultry, which could be fed scraps and required little space, eventually met the knife when grain was too precious to share. The problem with killing the breeding stock was obvious, but in the arithmetic of hunger, tomorrow's eggs weighed less than today's meal. Every animal slaughtered bought a few more days, but also narrowed the path forward. Without beasts to breed, to work the fields, or to produce milk, recovery from famine became slower, riskier. It was a bargain with no good outcome: live now, or live later, but rarely both. And when even the last familiar animals were gone, and the yards stood empty, people's appetites turned toward the truly marginal sources of food: the bitter, the toxic, the dangerous, the things that could only be eaten if the poison could be coaxed out. Famine foods were the plants and substances that everyone knew were edible only in theory: the bitter, fibrous, or outright toxic things that sat at the far edge of the menu, waiting for a year when hunger outweighed caution. They were survival's last resort, requiring more work to make safe than they provided in calories. Yet they appear in the historical record again and again. Like old acquaintances no one wants to visit, but everyone eventually does. Acorns are one of the most common examples. In good times, they were left for pigs. In bad times, they were gathered in baskets, shelled, and leached of their tannins in endless cycles of boiling and rinsing until the water ran clear. The resulting flour could be baked into dense, bitter loaves, hardly a delicacy, but better than starvation. In the American South during the Civil War, acorn coffee became a household staple. In Europe's medieval famines, it was a bread ingredient of last resort. Other plants carried more risk. In the Pacific, cycads, beautiful, palm-like trees, produced seeds laced with neurotoxins. Removing them involved soaking, pounding, drying, and washing again until the danger had hopefully been washed away. In parts of Africa, cassava left too little time to ferment retained enough cyanide to make people ill. During droughts, the rush to eat it often led to outbreaks of poisoning. Wild yams, bitter roots, and certain beans had their own chemical defenses, each demanding a local, inherited knowledge to neutralize. Even tree bark made appearances. Inner bark from pines and birches could be scraped, dried, and ground into flour. It was more fiber than food, but it could bulk out bread and stretch dwindling grain supplies. In northern Scandinavia, bark bread was common enough in lean years to have its own name, though it carried the reputation of a food eaten only by the desperate. Seaweeds and algae filled the same role along coasts. In Ireland during the potato famine, communities gathered dulls and carrageen moss, drying them for storage or boiling them into soups. Coastal Japan and Korea had long traditions of edible seaweed, but famine pushed inland populations to adopt them too, often without the skills to preserve them properly. The irony of famine foods was that they rarely provided the same nutrition as what they replaced. They filled the stomach, slowed the pangs, but often left people weak, malnourished, and still sliding toward starvation. Yet their psychological value was enormous. To chew something, to swallow something, was to keep the idea of eating alive. Once the list of plant options was exhausted, when even the bitterest and most labor-intensive foods were gone, the search shifted again, this time toward making the existing food stretch in ways that blurred the line between sustenance and illusion. Stretching food in famine years was less about cuisine and more about chemistry, the grim kind of kitchen innovation where the goal was to fool the eye and stomach long enough to survive another day. What passed for bread, stew, or porridge was often more filler than food, padded out with whatever the hands could grind fine enough to disappear into the main ingredient. Grain was the most common base for this sleight of hand, but pure grain became rare early on. Bakers mixed rye or wheat flour with milled straw, chaff, sawdust, or ground bark, creating loaves that held their shape but crumbled into splinters in the mouth. Archaeologists studying ancient grinding stones have found traces of such mixtures, fibrous plants or inedible husks, worked into dough in layers corresponding to known droughts or crop failures. In more recent famines, ground bones sometimes joined the mix, lending calcium to the bread, but also the faint smell of boiled stock gone sour. Soups became thin, almost ceremonial, with the main ingredients floating like rare visitors in a pot of hot water. A scrap of meat might be boiled, removed to feed someone else, then the broth served to a whole household. Vegetables could be reused in the same way, cooked until they fell apart, and then strained from the liquid, which was reheated and presented as another meal. Clay and earth sometimes crossed the line from adulterant to outright substitute. In parts of West Africa, certain clays were known to quell hunger pangs when nothing else was available, a practice with deep cultural roots, but one that offered no true nutrition. In extreme historical sieges, from ancient cities to early modern fortresses, dirt found its way into bread doughs simply to bulk it out, producing a gritty, stomach-scraping paste. Milk, if any could be found, was diluted with water until it lost both taste and color. Beer or ale, where brewing was possible, could be made from whatever starch was at hand. Dried roots, acorns, even parched peas, creating weak, sour drinks that filled the belly without truly feeding it. The logic behind all of this was painfully simple. A meal that looked and felt larger could delay the worst of hunger's gnawing, even if it did nothing to reverse the slow erosion of the body. But stretching food in this way also stretched tempers, especially when some households could still afford unadulterated meals. The sight of a neighbor's clean white loaf could be enough to spark a riot in times when one's own bread was gray and laced with splinters. Eventually, there was nothing left to dilute. When there was no grain to adulterate, no pot to stretch with broth, and no roots to pad with bark, the only way to eat was to get it from somewhere else, by bargain, by force, or by leaving entirely. When the last local stores were gone and the hedgerows stripped bare, the only hope lay in finding food elsewhere, or in taking it. Trade was the gentlest of these options, though famine rarely leaves much gentleness intact. Markets still opened in some towns, but the exchanges looked less like commerce and more like triage. Coins lost value when no one had surplus to sell. Barter returned in force, with tools, clothing, even labor traded for a sack of grain or a handful of dried fish. In medieval Europe, chroniclers describe families parting with heirlooms, silver spoons, wedding rings, just to keep bread on the table a few days longer. Where formal trade failed, raiding took its place. Borderlands became dangerous, not because of foreign armies, but because of hungry neighbors. Villages that still had stores, often because they'd been spared a bad harvest or had kept strong defenses, became targets for those with less. Raiding parties could be as small as a few desperate men, or as large as entire communities on the move. In the Norse sagas, some Viking expeditions are framed not as heroic conquests but as survival runs in years when crops failed at home. Migration was the slowest and most uncertain gamble. Families packed what they could carry and set off toward regions rumored to have food, often guided by nothing more than the word of a trader or traveler. The 19th century Irish potato famine saw hundreds of thousands leave for America, Canada, or Australia, but many more attempted shorter moves from west to east, rural to urban, coast to inland, only to find the famine waiting there too. In earlier centuries, Mongol steppe tribes shifted grazing routes southward during droughts, pressing into settled farmland and sparking conflicts that were as much about food as about territory. Sometimes these movements were sanctioned by rulers who preferred to export the hungry rather than feed them. Other times, they were met with violence at the border. Communities on the receiving end feared the spread of disease, the strain on their own supplies, or simply the political instability that came with swelling numbers of strangers. The act of leaving carried its own toll. Travel during famine meant exhaustion layered on malnutrition, and the weakest often died along the road. For those who survived the journey, the reward could be safety and a full stomach, or it could be the realization that the rumors were wrong. The supplies were gone, and there was nowhere left to run. And for the unluckiest, the next step after failed migration was one of the most extreme and least spoken of in human history, a choice only made when every other path had already closed. It appeared rarely, and almost always at the very edge of survival, but cannibalism leaves a mark in the historical record like few other famine measures. Not because it was common, it wasn't, but because it was the last, most complete admission that every other source of food had failed. The accounts are often whispered in official chronicles, buried in the middle of siege reports, or preserved in court records where survivors were tried for what they'd done to stay alive. The siege of Leningrad during the Second World War remains one of the most documented examples. 872 days without enough food, in temperatures that froze corpses where they fell. Arrest records show that corpse-eating cases were prosecuted separately from person-killing cases, a grim distinction meant to separate scavenging from murder. In some communities, the dead were quietly divided, flesh cooked into unrecognizable stews to spare families from acknowledging exactly what they were eating. Earlier examples are scattered across centuries. Chinese imperial histories mention incidents during prolonged droughts, where rural families exchanged children with neighbors to avoid eating their own. In colonial North America, the winter of 1609 to 1610, the starving time in Jamestown produced archaeological evidence of butchery marks on human bones, confirming what had long been rumored in written accounts. Arctic expeditions gone wrong tell the same story in smaller, starker scenes, frozen camps where survival depended on the bodies of those who had not survived the night. Anthropologists note that in nearly every case, cannibalism emerges not as an immediate reaction to hunger, but as a last, slow crossing of a moral line after all other measures, foraging, slaughtering animals, famine foods, even eating leather or bark have failed. The social cost was often as great as the physical risk. Survivors carried stigma long after the famine itself was over, their names linked forever to what they'd done. Even in the rare cases where the practice was ritualized, as in some documented pre-modern societies during extraordinary shortages, the decision was bounded by strict rules: who could be eaten, in what context, and how the act was to be acknowledged or hidden. Such rules didn't remove the horror, they only contained it. Cannibalism's appearance in famine history is a signal of absolute collapse, not just of agriculture or trade, but of the entire web of cultural norms that define how humans feed themselves. And once a society had gone that far, the return to ordinary patterns of eating, sharing, and trusting could take generations. Yet even in places that never crossed that final threshold, famine still reshaped the way people thought about food, not just in the moment, but for decades after, embedding new rituals, restrictions, and moral codes to guard against ever facing such scarcity again. When a famine ended, or at least loosened its grip, communities rarely returned to the same casual relationship with food they'd had before. Scarcity carved deep into the cultural memory, and what emerged afterward was often a set of rituals, rules, and social controls designed to prevent, delay, or at least prepare for the next disaster. In some cases, this took the form of strict grain storage systems. Imperial China's ever-normal granaries were an institutional memory of repeated crop failures, ensuring that surplus from good years was stored for lean ones. Ancient Egypt's state granaries served the same function, their capacity built on the backs of harvest taxes. Where centralized storage wasn't possible, smaller village or clan-based granaries operated under watchful eyes, sometimes guarded like treasuries. Access was rationed, with fines or public shaming for those caught hoarding or stealing. Ritual also played its part, embedding food security into religion and custom. In parts of West Africa, harvest festivals doubled as accounting events. Elders measured communal stores, blessed them, and made offerings to ensure the next year's abundance. In medieval Europe, fast days dictated by the church, ostensibly for spiritual discipline, also happened to reduce meat consumption, indirectly stretching supplies. Seasonal feasts were timed not just to agricultural cycles, but to moments when larders could handle the strain. Scarcity gave rise to etiquette rules that outsiders might find strange but locals understood instinctively. In some post-famine societies, it became impolite, even offensive, to refuse food when offered, because sharing was a moral obligation forged in crisis. Elsewhere, certain foods acquired symbolic weight. In Japan, rice was treated with a reverence far beyond its nutritional role. In parts of Ethiopia, injera became not just a staple but a reminder of resilience, its preparation tied to communal labor and mutual aid. These rituals could also serve as warnings. In Scandinavia, bark bread recipes survived for generations, not because anyone wanted to eat it, but because preserving the knowledge meant the next famine would find people slightly less unprepared. The same logic lay behind keeping famine foods in oral tradition, not as delicacies, but as grim insurance policies passed from grandmother to child. At their core, these practices were about control, controlling supply, controlling distribution, and controlling behavior. Hunger had shown how quickly norms could unravel. The rules and rituals that followed were an attempt to knit them back together before the next unraveling began. And yet, no matter how elaborate the safeguards, history shows that they were never enough to fully stop famine from returning. The next failure of rains, the next blight, the next war would come, and the cycle of improvisation, desperation, and survival would begin again, leaving behind another layer of scars in the collective memory. The first thing people noticed was that the daylight had gone wrong. It wasn't night, but it wasn't exactly day either. More like the sun had been wrapped in old, yellowed linen and left to hang there. A faint, sickly disk in a sky, the color of dirty water. By the middle of the 6th century, across Europe, the Middle East, and as far as China, records spoke of a sun without brightness, of mornings where shadows never appeared, of seasons that felt like dusk dragged out for months. To the people of Constantinople, this was no ordinary weather. Chroniclers, whose job it was to look for patterns that matched scripture or history, reached for the most unsettling parallels they could find. It felt like the great omens before Rome's fall, or the plagues in Egypt, or the signs that heralded the Last Judgment. In Ireland, the annals spoke of a failure of bread. Their polite way of saying famine had followed close on the heels of the darkness. In China, court historians noted frost in summer and a pall over the land. The emperor himself forced to issue decrees of penitence to appease heaven. The logic was simple and ruthless. When the skies behave, the rulers are virtuous. When the skies sulk, someone up high has displeased the divine. Suddenly, emperors and kings had to prove their innocence by public acts of humility, walking barefoot in processions, distributing grain, building temples, anything to show they weren't the cause of the cosmic sulk overhead. It didn't matter whether the actual culprit was a volcano half a world away. Politics in an age of divine causation was never going to be that forgiving. Ordinary people read the sky in their own way. The pale sun meant old prophecies were coming due. In the marketplaces of Alexandria and Antioch, sellers muttered that the merchants of the end times would soon be measuring grain in silver instead of copper. Farmers left fields unplanted, unwilling to waste seed when the sun clearly had no intention of helping. In fishing villages, the horizon's strange haze was treated as a bad sign for sailors. Fewer boats went out, further shrinking the food supply. And, because humanity has never resisted the urge to make symbols out of disasters, the dim light acquired a personality. Some said it was a veiled bride, sulking after being insulted by Earth. Others imagined it as a wounded animal, limping along the sky, in need of offerings. In a world where almost no one understood volcanic ash or atmospheric scattering, the explanation that involved a moody celestial being was, frankly, more satisfying. The uncertainty turned every sunrise into a ritual moment. People would pause, glance up, and quietly check if the world was ending today, or merely continuing its slow decline. Chroniclers, both Christian and pagan, wrote with the same uneasy mix of awe and resignation. The sun had betrayed them, and the gods, whichever ones they believed in, were making their displeasure visible for all to see. And when the heavens seem angry, the next question is always the same: what will it take to make them forgive? When the sky refuses to brighten, preachers don't waste time waiting for explanations from astronomers. They climb onto carts, stone steps, or the nearest barrel and declare, with enviable confidence, that they know exactly what's going on. In the 6th century, as the ashen gloom lingered, itinerant holy men and local prophets found themselves in sudden demand. Some styled themselves as guardians of the true calendar, claiming this was the long-foretold darkness from the Book of Revelation. Others saw it as a new flood, except this time the water was invisible and seeped into crops, minds, and morals. The fact that famine and disease were already tightening their grip on entire regions only made their words feel more credible. It wasn't confined to Christian Europe. In the Byzantine Empire, ascetics in the desert warned that the world's sins had grown so heavy that even the sun could no longer lift its face. In India, some Hindu sages interpreted the dim light as the sign of a world deep into Kali Yuga, the dark age of decline. In China, Taoist masters traveled with talismans and incantations said to clear the heavens and restore cosmic balance. The messages differed, but the rhythm was the same. Something has gone wrong, and only we know the path back. What made this moment fertile for such voices wasn't just fear, it was the absolute collapse of reliable cause and effect. Farmers prayed for rain, and it snowed instead. Seas remained cold through midsummer. Livestock miscarried. In the absence of a stable world, any confident narrative, no matter how strange, had the weight of truth. Some of these preachers gained massive followings. Villagers pooled their resources to follow a charismatic figure on a pilgrimage, abandoning homes and fields in the belief that salvation lay elsewhere. Town councils, unable to keep order with dwindling grain stores, often gave these figures protection and a platform, if only to channel the population's desperation into something that looked like hope. And, as always, a few saw opportunity in the gloom. Relics were rediscovered in timely fashion. Small shrines became overnight pilgrimage sites, their keepers suddenly wealthy from offerings. Amulets made of bone, carved with crude suns, sold briskly in markets. If belief could not bring back the light, at least it could give people something to carry in their pockets. The darkness itself seemed to encourage performance. Preachers lit great bonfires as they spoke, casting enormous shadows on nearby walls, their figures flickering like supernatural messengers. In the pale daylight, they wore white robes to stand out against the smudged sky. Every sermon was a spectacle, every pronouncement a last warning. And the crowd, huddled together in half-light, listened, because even if the words were nonsense, they gave shape to something shapeless. And once a shape is given, it's only a short step to deciding it has a name, a will, and demands that must be met, which leads, inevitably, to the making of new beings to blame, to bargain with, or to beg for mercy. In a world half-lit and half-frozen, imagination doesn't just run wild, it reorganizes the entire pantheon. People begin inventing new figures to explain what the old ones apparently couldn't handle. In some parts of Europe, the sun was no longer simply a celestial body. It became a captive, held hostage by shadowy wardens in the upper air. Peasants in the Alps told of sky thieves, unseen beings who had stolen daylight and locked it in a mountain of glass. The only way to release it, they said, was through offerings left at high passes, where winds screamed like imprisoned spirits. Elsewhere, the figures were more benevolent, at least in theory. Chroniclers in Byzantine territories mention strange new saints who appeared in visions, robed figures holding torches. said to walk the earth in search of the gate of light. These weren't canonized by any church, but their names spread in whispers, painted onto tiny wooden icons carried by travelers. In fishing villages along the Mediterranean, some households lit lamps each dawn not for warmth, but to guide the sun's servant back to its master. The North had its own adaptations. In Scandinavia, where winters were already long, the sudden absence of summer light encouraged older myths to be repurposed. People spoke of wolves that had not just chased the sun but finally caught it, leaving only their breath in the sky. Some carved protective charms in the shape of snares to trap the hunters of the light. The creation of these beings wasn't just superstition, it was a coping mechanism. Naming a force made it negotiable. If the sun had been stolen, then it could be ransomed. If it had wandered off, it could be lured back. Whole rituals grew around these ideas, blending old agricultural prayers with new, improvised gestures. A torch raised toward the east at dawn, a bowl of grain left on the roof, a child's first haircut given to the fire. Even in the cities, these invented figures slipped into daily life. Market stalls sold small amulets with crude suns stamped onto bits of tin. Families hung wreaths made of whatever green they could find, claiming they kept shadow spirits away from the door. In Constantinople, some believed the Archangel Michael himself had taken physical form to battle the smoke demons that clogged the sky. Of course, the Church, wherever it had the power, tried to rein things back into orthodoxy, folding these creations into existing doctrine. But belief is opportunistic, and the darkness gave birth to a spiritual grey market where saints and spirits traded places freely. And once these new entities were in place, the next step seemed obvious. Give them something to do. Assign them the task of fixing the sky. That, in turn, meant creating rituals aimed squarely at coaxing the light back into the world. Once the new saints, spirits, and celestial troublemakers had been firmly imagined into existence, it was only a matter of time before people began inventing ways to lure the sun back, or force it. Across the dimmed world, rituals blossomed like frost flowers, strange hybrids of older seasonal rites and improvisations born of desperation. In southern Europe, village squares became stages for torch processions. Even in broad daylight, which was still dark enough to make flames stand out like molten threads in the air, people marched in slow circles, chanting prayers that mixed Christian litanies with phrases no priest would recognize, invoking the golden wheel or the bride of morning to rise and warm the earth again. Candles were placed in every window, their smoke curling up like tiny signals to the heavens. The logic was simple. If light had fled, then more light must be offered in its honor. In Spain and Italy, these rituals merged with carnival traditions. Masks shaped like the sun's face appeared, worn by dancers who leaped over small bonfires as if chasing away whatever had swallowed the sky. The masks themselves were crude but deliberate, wide, startled eyes, a mouth fixed between a smile and a grimace, radiating carved rays like a child's drawing of the sun. Further north, the approach was less theatrical and more grimly practical. In German-speaking lands, farmers dug great pits, filled them with pitch and tar, and set them alight, the flames roaring high enough to be seen for miles. Some said the heat would melt the frost from the sky. Others believed the smell alone would drive away the cloud beasts that were keeping the light captive. In the Low Countries, fishermen gathered along the coast with long poles tipped in burning resin, waving them toward the horizon until their arms ached. In the Eastern Roman Empire, processions took on a martial tone. Icons of Christ's Pantocrator and the Virgin were carried along the city walls, facing outward, not for the benefit of the citizens inside, but as a warning to whatever forces outside the world might be meddling with the sun. Priests swung censers heavy with incense, the smoke mingling with the ever-present haze that clung to the air. And then there were the quieter, household rites. In rural Ireland and Scotland, mothers would wake their children before dawn to watch a small fire lit in the hearth, whispering that the flames were a piece of the sun brought indoors for safekeeping. In Armenia, families left bread on rooftops for the sun's servants to find and deliver to their master. In parts of Syria, jars of oil were left open in the sunless light to catch what little fire still wandered the earth. None of these practices restored the sun's strength, of course, but that was hardly the point. Rituals don't need to work to matter, they just need to give people a sense that they're not entirely at the mercy of forces they can't name. And when enough people are lighting fires and chanting to a veiled sky, the air fills with the conviction that something might change. But conviction alone isn't enough when the earth is freezing and the fields are dying. That's when ritual starts to cross the line into sacrifice, the belief that only by giving something precious can you hope to win back the light. When prayers, torches, and processions failed to coax the sun out of hiding, some communities decided the problem wasn't the ritual, it was the offering. The thinking was as old as humanity itself. If the gods, spirits, or whatever cosmic officials ran the sky weren't listening, maybe they needed something worth their attention. In Scandinavia, sagas and later church condemnations tell of livestock driven into sacred groves and slaughtered under the pale light, their blood painted in spirals on stones. The idea wasn't merely to feed unseen beings, but to give them a sign they could recognize: red against gray, warmth against cold. Some rites even specified the heart as the true gift, burned so that its smoke might rise faster to the heavens. Further south, in the Carpathian Mountains, folk tradition speaks of shadow feasts, where entire villages contributed what little food they had to one massive communal meal, not for themselves, but left on an altar of packed snow. Bread, cheese, and salted meat were piled high, only to be abandoned overnight. An extravagant waste in a year when even weeds struggled to grow. By morning, animals or the weather had scattered the offerings, but people spoke of them as taken by those who ruled the sun's path. In the eastern Mediterranean, the sacrifices could turn dangerously symbolic. In some towns, young women were dressed in white and paraded through the streets with wreaths of evergreen, representing the bride of the sun. Though there's no clear evidence of harm coming to them, the unsettling implication lingered that in worse times, the stand-in might not be symbolic at all. Chroniclers in Anatolia hinted at gifts of the breath being made, though whether this meant human life or the release of animals is left deliberately vague. And then there were the smaller, household sacrifices, no less sincere for being less dramatic. In rural France and Italy, families burned the last of their stored grain, letting the smell drift out the chimney as a reminder to the heavens of what they were missing. Fishermen in Brittany threw their first catch of the week back into the sea without gutting it, calling it the sun's portion. The sacrifices were always a gamble. Sometimes the following days would be marginally warmer or brighter, enough for people to believe the offering had been accepted. More often, nothing happened, but the absence of change was simply blamed on not giving enough. The logic was circular, airtight, and impossible to disprove. It's here, in the uneasy space between ritual and desperation, that belief can tilt toward something sharper, the conviction that the darkness is not just a cosmic accident, but an active punishment, and punishment implies guilt. If the light hasn't returned, then someone must have done something to keep it away. When the sky refuses to brighten and the cold keeps crawling into every corner of life, people start looking for someone to blame. It's far easier to believe that a neighbor's secret sin is holding the sun hostage than to accept that the world is simply indifferent. In parts of Central Europe, chroniclers describe public gatherings where the villagers debated, in the loosest sense of the word, who among them might have turned the light away. Suspicion often fell on the socially inconvenient, the widow who refused remarriage, the man with a limp, the family that never quite fit in. The accusations were rarely about evidence, and almost always about familiarity. The guilty were those everyone already found irritating. In Livonia and along the Baltic coast, records speak of witch trials tied directly to the endless dimness. Here the alleged crime was not riding broomsticks but milking the sun, an image both absurd and vividly literal. The accused were said to have drawn away the warmth and locked it in their homes, hoarding it for themselves while the rest of the world froze. These trials were theater as much as punishment, the public drama of tying someone to a stake or tossing them into icy water serving as both entertainment and moral warning. Elsewhere, the target shifted from individuals to entire groups. In the German-speaking lands, traveling merchants, outsiders by definition, were accused of bringing the darkness in their packs. Rumors claimed that their goods carried a sky plague that ate the sun from the inside. In some towns, foreign traders were driven out in midwinter. Their wares burned in the market square while the crowd chanted for the light's return. The church, for its part, often redirected the blame toward theological enemies. In Catholic regions, the year without light was painted as a punishment for heretics. In Protestant ones, it was divine wrath for papists. The absurdity was perfectly symmetrical, each side accusing the other of personally offending the cosmic order. In more remote regions, the guilty party might not even be human. Wolves, ravens, or even certain winds were said to have swallowed the sun whole. Hunting expeditions were launched not for food, but to kill the creature thought to be hiding the light in its belly. The logic was intoxicating. If someone had caused the darkness, then removing them could restore the light. Every failure to do so only sharpened the need to try again. A cycle that kept communities busy in the dangerous months when idleness might lead to despair. And yet, beneath the noise of accusation and punishment, there was always the quieter, more enduring fear that no matter how many scapegoats you found, the sun might never return. That dread, in turn, began to twist belief into stranger shapes, giving rise to a new set of prophecies and warnings. Once the hunt for culprits failed to produce results, as it inevitably did, people turned to those who claimed they had seen further than the rest, not with telescopes or measurements, but with dreams, visions, and the unnerving certainty that the darkness was only the beginning. In England and France, broadsheets began circulating, reporting the words of self-styled prophets who claimed that the year without light was merely the first chapter in a long decline. Some swore the sun had died entirely, and what little glow remained was its corpse light, soon to fade forever. The language was rich with decay. The heavens were described as rotting from the top down, the stars as holes gnawed by the worms of eternity. Further east, in Russia and the Balkans, village seers described dreams in which the sun was chained at the bottom of the sea, guarded by serpents as long as rivers. Release, they claimed, would only come after a generation of fasting and penance. Conveniently for the prophets, they rarely specified whose generation, a delay that kept them relevant without risking deadlines. In the Ottoman domains, storytellers folded the endless twilight into older apocalyptic traditions. Here, the dim light was the smoke of the sun's funeral, a slow-burning pyre that would end with the sky collapsing into the earth. Crowds gathered in coffeehouses to hear these tales, the mixture of dread and spectacle proving almost addictive. But perhaps the strangest prophecies came from itinerant preachers who claimed that the darkness was not punishment, but an invitation. They insisted the absence of light was a door, a literal, physical passage through which new beings would emerge. Some said angels, others swore demons, and a few whispered that it would be both at once, depending entirely on whether you'd kept the right customs during the year. The ambiguity kept people guessing and, more importantly, kept the prophets fed. These visions didn't stay confined to sermons or marketplaces. They began to shape the way people planned their days, stored food, or even married. In parts of Scandinavia, couples postponed weddings, believing the lack of sun would curse their fertility. In alpine valleys, families built extra cellars, not for food but for hiding, convinced that a wave of supernatural hunters would arrive under cover of the long dimness. The trouble with prophecy, of course, is that it doesn't need to come true to feel real. Once you've been told the light might never return, every cold dawn feels like proof, every dim noon like confirmation. And when belief tightens like that, it often starts to demand more than just watching and waiting. It begins to ask for proof of loyalty in the half-light of those endless days. Promises took on a peculiar weight. It wasn't enough to hope the sun would return. People wanted to bind themselves to the idea, to wrap it in ceremony so tight that breaking faith with it would feel like a sin. In alpine villages, farmers swore public oaths to keep their fires burning until daylight came back in full. No matter how scarce the fuel, the hearth became less a source of heat than a kind of shrine, its embers a miniature sun guarded by the household. If the fire went out, it was whispered, the real sun would take that as permission to do the same. Along the Baltic coast, fishing communities took to carving their vows into wood, flat boards, marked with runic symbols and buried in sand at low tide. The incoming sea would read the message and carry it to whatever powers were hiding the light. These boards were sometimes dug up months later and kept as talismans, physical proof that the family had made their offering to the pact. In parts of Italy, convents and monasteries made collective promises to eat nothing fresh until the sun returned, living entirely off preserved and dried stores. This was not as noble as it sounds. Fresh food was almost non-existent anyway, but the vow gave scarcity a veneer of choice. If you were going hungry, it wasn't because the world was collapsing, but because you were spiritually committed. Some covenants were stranger still. In rural Hungary, there are fragmentary accounts of mirror fasts, pledges not to look at one's own reflection until the light came back. The idea was that mirrors could trap sunlight, and in times like these, you didn't dare take any for yourself. The practice turned faces into mysteries. Months might pass before someone saw their own features again, and more than one person claimed to have looked older, as if the sun's absence had carved the years in silence. What made these vows potent wasn't just the ritual, but the mutual surveillance. If your neighbor promised to keep a lamp burning and it went dark, everyone knew. If you swore off certain foods and were caught chewing them, your weakness became the community's shame. The darkness outside was matched by a subtle tightening of control inside, the unspoken understanding that the sun would not forgive the failures of a few. But even oaths were thin. The longer the light stayed weak, the harder it was to believe that personal sacrifice could sway the heavens. And when faith in vows began to fade, people started looking for physical, mechanical ways to push the sky back into place. When prayer, sacrifice, and solemn promises failed to coax the light back, ingenuity or desperation took over. Across Europe and beyond, people began to build things, not small, sensible things, but contraptions designed with the unshakable conviction that the sun could be lured, trapped, or yanked into place, if only you had the right mechanism. In the Low Countries, millwrights repurposed windmills into sun catchers by fitting the sails with sheets of polished metal. The idea was to gather what faint rays there were and reflect them upward, a kind of optical bribe to remind the sun where it belonged. These devices often blinded anyone who stood too close, which was taken as proof they were working. In Poland, blacksmiths hammered together enormous iron cages meant to hold the sun once it returned. These stood in open fields, gaping at the sky, sometimes decorated with garlands as if they were festival arches. When nothing happened, they simply rusted in place, becoming accidental monuments to human optimism. The English countryside saw the rise of light towers, crude wooden scaffolds topped with burning tar barrels. The flames were meant to act as a beacon, a lighthouse for the wandering sun. Inevitably, a few of these structures burned down entire barns or homes, but the logic was hard to fault in the moment. Better to lose a building than the day itself. Some efforts were almost touching in their scale. In the Swiss Alps, farmers laid out enormous white sheets on snowfields, hoping the brightness would trick the heavens into thinking the world was still worth illuminating. From above, it might have looked like the land itself was holding up a mirror. Even more bizarre were the sky drums of rural Germany, vast hide-covered frames beaten in slow rhythms at dawn and dusk. The sound was said to wake the sun, much like knocking on a neighbor's door. One village managed to keep this up for months, the drumming becoming a kind of heartbeat that pulsed through the valley long after anyone believed it was doing any good. But for all the creativity, none of these machines worked in the way people hoped. At best, they offered distraction, a visible sign that something was being done. And in a year, when the days felt hollow and the nights endless, the illusion of action was often more important than the result. Still, each failed invention left behind something tangible: gleaming metal, charred beams, rusted gears. These relics, in turn, began to weave themselves into local folklore, taking on lives of their own long after the ash had settled. When the light finally crept back, pale at first, like a guest arriving late to a feast it didn't really want to attend, the world didn't simply shake off the year without it. The cold and ash may have lifted, but the stories stayed, clinging like smoke to the walls of memory. In villages from Ireland to the Carpathians, children grew up hearing that the dim year had been a warning, and that the sun could be taken again if people grew careless. Parents told them not to quarrel before sunrise, lest they split the day in half. Fishermen refused to cast nets on certain dates, claiming the last time they had the sun had hidden in shame. Farmers kept small mirrors above their doors, not to admire themselves, but to remind the light it was welcome. The old oaths and strange covenants became moral lessons. In the Baltic, a broken promise was said to steal the warmth from the year. In alpine valleys, failing to tend your hearth meant you were asking the sun to leave. The practical origins faded, replaced by a quiet superstition that shaped the rhythm of life for generations. Even the failed machines survived, not in function, but in myth. The rusted iron cages of Poland became giant bird traps in children's tales, meant to snare the mythical raven that had swallowed the sun. The scorched light towers of England turned into ghost stories, their blackened frames said to glow faintly on moonless nights. The sky drums of Germany found new purpose in seasonal festivals, where they were beaten not to wake the sun, but to remind the village that it had once gone missing. These fragments of belief stitched themselves into the larger fabric of European folklore, traveling with migrants, morphing with each retelling. By the time the volcanic cause of the darkness was understood centuries later, the old explanations hadn't vanished. They'd simply become part of the background hum of the human imagination, where truth and story often trade clothes without anyone noticing. In the end, the year without light left no single lesson, only the uneasy reminder that the sky is not obliged to behave. People learned, perhaps reluctantly, that survival isn't just about food and warmth, but about finding ways to keep meaning alive when the world turns strange. And sometimes, that meaning lingers longer than the disaster itself, a shadow that moves with you, even when the sun is shining again.